Why was the morning air colder than usual even under the Kentucky sun? Maybe it was just her. Staff Sergeant Maria walked slower than the rest, boots striking the pavement in measured rhythm, left arm pressed close to her body as if protecting it from the world. Soldiers ahead of her stretched, laughed, adjusted their gear, preparing for another round of morning PT. For them it was routine. For her, it was a test of something more than muscle and endurance. It was a test of patience, of pride, of whether she still belonged here. She felt the weight of it all in her shoulder, the familiar ache that came alive with every movement, an ache that was no stranger. It carried the sound of metal shattering the night sky in Afghanistan, the flash that had thrown her against the side of a vehicle, the searing burn of shrapnel tearing muscle and bone. That night was 2 years past, but wounds don't vanish just because calendars flip. Some live under the skin forever. Colonel Harrison was already on the field, rigid as stone, eyes scanning his formation like a hawk that never forgave weakness. Soldiers whispered about him, how he'd once run 5 miles on a sprained ankle, how he pushed his companies harder than anyone on base. But whispered admiration always carried something else too: fear. He wasn't the kind of man to tolerate explanations. Excuses, he called them. Weakness in uniform. Maria fell into the back row. She hated the back row. It was where doubt lived, where whispers carried, where someone like her could be forgotten or targeted. She tried to stretch her left arm just a little, and pain shot through her shoulder like a lightning bolt. Not today, she thought. Not again. Listen up, soldiers, Harrison's voice cracked across the field. Combat fitness test, push-ups, sit-ups, 2-mile run. No complaints, no sob stories. You signed up to be warriors, act like it. His words hit her gut. She knew this was coming. She also knew she wouldn't survive push-ups the way he demanded them. The medical profile tucked neatly into her file said as much: modified training only, but she had never shown it to him, never dared. Paperwork felt like admitting defeat, and Maria didn't quit. When the order came, she dropped to the ground like everyone else. Dirt clung to her palms. She lowered her body once, twice. Then fire shot through her shoulder, violent and merciless. By the third attempt she collapsed, her face pressing against the earth, not from exhaustion, from pain, the kind of pain that doesn't ask permission. And the colonel noticed. Boots crunched across the field, stopping beside her. His shadow fell long across her back. His voice cut like a knife. What's wrong with you? Are you even trying? Every ear turned, though every eye pretended not to. The rest kept moving, push-ups counting off in steady rhythm, but the air shifted. Soldiers stole glances. Everyone knew what it meant when Harrison stopped over someone. It meant blood in the water. This is pathetic, he barked. I've seen recruits perform better on day one. Her shoulders screamed as she forced one more attempt. Halfway down, her body betrayed her, collapsing under the weight of her own determination. Sweat broke on her forehead, not from exertion, but from the sharp electric agony running down her arm. Sir, she forced, voice trembling only at the edges. I have a medical condition that affects my ability to do standard push-ups. Condition? His laugh was bitter, hollow. Let me guess. A hangnail, a headache. Maybe your back hurts from sleeping wrong. Murmurs shifted through the formation. Soldiers knew Maria wasn't like that. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't weak. They'd seen her, heard of her. Combat medic. Afghanistan. Stories of bravery whispered in barracks late at night. But no one spoke up now, not against a colonel. Her face burned. Shame pressed hot against her skin. She wanted to tell him everything, about Afghanistan, the IED, the surgeries that pieced her body back together. But explaining sounded like excuses, and Maria hated excuses. Sir, I have documentation, she said, voice steady even as her hands trembled. Documentation. He leaned closer, voice dripping contempt. I don't care about your paperwork. I care about results. Either you can do the job or you can't. And right now it looks like you can't. Her jaw tightened. Around her, push-ups stopped. Soldiers froze mid-motion, watching. The colonel's voice carried across the field, louder now, sharper. This is exactly what's wrong with today's army. Soldiers wanting special treatment for every little ache and pain. Every word was a hammer against her chest. She remembered the convoy, the flash, the silence after the explosion. She remembered waking in a hospital, her arm strapped, her shoulder rebuilt with metal plates. They'd told her she was lucky. Lucky. She still wondered what that meant. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive," Harrison roared. "I've seen real warriors fight through injuries, finish missions. They didn't make excuses." The anger came alive in her chest, hot and raw. She had fought through injuries. She had dragged broken men from burning trucks, patched wounds with her own body bleeding. She had chosen duty over survival more times than she could count. And now, in front of everyone, this man was calling her less than a soldier. She forced herself to stand, at attention, shoulder throbbing so hard she thought it might break all over again. And then he said it. "You know what I think. I think you're a coward." The word struck harder than shrapnel ever had. A coward. Her knees nearly buckled under it. She had been called many things, stubborn, reckless, brave, but never that, never. The field went silent. Soldiers stopped mid-motion. Even the wind seemed to die. Every eye turned to her. Every ear waited. Her chest rose and fell in controlled rhythm. Breath in, breath out. The word echoed in her skull, pulsing with the memory of fire and blood and screams on a foreign road. She looked straight into the colonel's eyes. And something inside her shifted. She reached for her zipper. The sound was small, metallic, but in the silence it might as well have been thunder. Slowly, deliberately, she peeled her jacket from her shoulders. Pain stabbed through the left as she pulled, but she ignored it, folding the jacket with military precision, laying it on the ground. Gasps whispered through the formation. Confusion swept across the colonel's face. Then she lifted her shirt. The scars caught the sun, raised, pale, crossing her shoulder and back like a map of war itself. Thick ridges where shrapnel had kissed too deep, thin lines where surgeons had carved to save her. One scar thick and angry, running down from shoulder blade to rib. A wound that had once held death inches from her heart. The silence broke into a wave of sharp breaths, disbelief, the sound of truth revealed without a single word spoken. She stood tall, scars exposed, voice clear and even. "These are from Afghanistan, sir. Convoy hit an IED. I was treating 3 wounded when it went off. Even after it did this," she gestured to the web of scars across her body, "I kept working until the helicopters came. 2 men are alive today because I did not stop." Her words carried not as argument, not as excuse, but as fact. And for the first time, Colonel Harrison had no answer. Why did no one breathe? Why did the whole field seem suspended, frozen in that impossible silence? Maybe it was because scars spoke louder than words ever could. The soldiers saw them, raised, uneven, unforgiving marks that had carved Maria into the woman standing before them. Colonel Harrison stood pale, lips parted but no sound escaping. He had expected an excuse. He had expected shame. What he got instead was truth, raw and undeniable, cut into her flesh by fire and steel. Maria lowered her shirt slowly, not out of embarrassment but out of dignity. She zipped her jacket with steady hands, though pain flared at the movement. She had revealed just enough, not for pity, not for revenge, but because the word coward was one she could never leave unanswered. The field stirred. Soldiers shifted, their push-ups forgotten, their runs delayed. Some had tears in their eyes, though none would admit it. They had seen battle wounds before, but not exposed this way, not as testimony, not as defiance wrapped in quiet resolve. One soldier broke the silence. A sergeant first class, Johnson, stepped forward, his voice carrying across the stunned formation. "Staff Sergeant served with distinction in my unit overseas," he said, tone firm, deliberate. "She's one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to serve alongside." The spell cracked. Another voice rose. "She pulled me out of a burning vehicle in Kandahar," Specialist Martinez called out. His words were louder, desperate almost, like a confession that had been waiting years. Carried me to safety even though she was hit herself. Corporal Williams added, best medic in the theater, saved my life twice in one deployment. The field erupted, not in chaos, not in rebellion, but in truth finally unshackled. Stories poured out, testimonies that painted Maria not as weak, not as fragile, but as one of the strongest among them. Colonel Harrison's face shifted from white to red, then to something that looked dangerously close to shame. His authority hung fragile in the air, thin as glass about to shatter. Maria stood still. She hadn't asked for their voices. She hadn't expected them. Yet they came, soldier after soldier, until her name hung in the air like a banner, undeniable and unbroken. Harrison raised a hand, desperate to quiet the murmurs. Enough, he barked, but his voice lacked the steel it once carried. He swallowed hard, searching for footing he had already lost. Staff Sergeant, his words faltered, thinner than anyone had ever heard them. I didn't know. But ignorance was no shield. Not here, not after everything he had said. Maria's chin lifted slightly, but she didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her silence, her scars, and the voices of her brothers and sisters in arms said everything. The colonel cleared his throat, trying to gather authority back around him like a cloak that no longer fit. All soldiers, he commanded, resume your exercises, modified training for those with medical profiles, as prescribed. But his words felt hollow. The soldiers obeyed out of habit, out of discipline, but the rhythm was gone. The energy drained, replaced by something heavier, more enduring. Respect no longer flowed toward the colonel. It flowed toward Maria. She completed her modified exercises quietly, ignoring the sting in her shoulder, ignoring the looks that followed her, some admiring, some apologetic, some guilty for not speaking sooner. She did not revel in their praise. She did not seek their sympathy. She did her job. Yet inside her chest ached, not from injury but from the memory the confrontation had ripped open. Afghanistan wasn't gone. It was never gone. The dust, the blast, the screams, they returned every time she touched the scars, every time pain whispered that she was different now. Not weaker, just changed. When the session ended, soldiers gathered in small groups, whispering, retelling, reshaping the morning already into legend. Maria heard fragments up real bad, medic in Kandahar. Called her a coward, but she kept walking, head high, boots steady. She would not live in gossip. The colonel retreated to his office without another word. His silence spoke louder than his insults ever had. The story had already crossed the base. By noon, everyone knew. By evening, officers in the command center whispered over coffee, voices low but incredulous. A colonel had publicly humiliated a wounded warrior. A colonel had called a decorated combat medic a coward. General, the base commander, heard it last. His aide entered with a folder, tone clipped. "Sir, there was an incident this morning." The general listened, his jaw tightening with every detail. He knew Maria by reputation. Bronze Star, Purple Hearts, commendations stacked neatly in her record. A soldier who had bled for her country more than most. And now, she was the center of a storm. But Maria didn't think of storms. She sat at her desk, hands folded, trying to focus on inventory reports. Numbers blurred, memories didn't. She kept seeing Harrison's face, the sneer when he said coward, the disbelief when her scars proved him wrong. She told herself she had done what she had to. She told herself it was over, but the ache inside said otherwise. Her fellow soldiers stopped by. Johnson, Williams, Martinez, they came with words of respect, of solidarity. "We've got your back," Johnson said simply, and she believed him. But no words stitched the wound left by that morning. Not the physical pain, not the deeper one, the reminder that even inside the uniform, even inside her own army, she had to fight to be seen. That night Maria lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat. The barracks were quiet, but her mind was. She thought about Afghanistan, about the men she saved, about the ones she couldn't. She thought about her scars, not the ones on her body, but the invisible ones, the doubts, the loneliness, the way Harrison's words had cut deeper than shrapnel ever could. And yet beneath it all she felt something else. Not pride, not anger, something quieter, dignity. Because dignity didn't shout. It didn't demand. It stood, scars bared, and let the truth speak for itself. The next morning, word came. General wanted her in his office. She didn't know why, not yet. But she knew one thing. Whatever it was, yesterday's silence had already changed everything. Why did General want to see her? The question pulsed in Maria's head as she walked across the base the next morning. Every soldier she passed seemed to glance at her differently. Some nodded with respect, others whispered behind cupped hands. The story had traveled faster than she could have imagined. She felt its weight on her shoulders almost as heavily as the pain that never left her. Her boots echoed on the polished floor of the command building. The air inside was cooler, quieter, heavy with the authority that lived in these walls. She paused outside the general's office, steadying her breathing. She'd been in combat zones, dragged bleeding men from fire, stared death in the face. But standing before this door, she felt something different. Not fear, unease. The aide nodded her in. The general sat behind his desk, posture calm but commanding, his eyes fixed on her as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Sit." She obeyed, sitting straight, hands resting on her thighs. She kept her face neutral, but her heart raced. "I've heard about yesterday," began. "I've heard a great deal." He tapped a folder on his desk, the kind that carried weight, the kind that told a soldier her life had already been dissected on paper. What happened on that field has spread across this base and beyond. Maria swallowed, holding her silence. She wasn't sure what he wanted from her, an apology, an explanation, a defense. But she had already given all she had to give. The general studied her for a long moment. "Do you know what bothers me most about this?" he asked. She shook her head. "That a colonel, one of my commanders, stood in front of his soldiers and called a combat medic a coward." His tone sharpened. "And worse, that he did it to a soldier who has bled more for this country than most ever will." The words struck Maria harder than Harrison's insults had. Respect, genuine, measured respect, was something she rarely heard, even after all she'd endured. She lowered her eyes, her throat tightening. "Sir," she said softly, "I don't need pity. I just want to serve. To be allowed to do the job I've fought to come back to." Leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "That's exactly why you deserve better than what happened. What you faced yesterday wasn't just disrespect. It was ignorance. And ignorance has no place in leadership." The silence stretched. Maria felt both exposed and strangely relieved. She had braced for punishment, for skepticism. Instead, she found something she hadn't expected: understanding. Finally, the general spoke again. "Colonel Harrison will answer for this. His conduct was unacceptable. Effective immediately, he's relieved of command pending review." Maria's breath caught. She hadn't wanted revenge. But hearing those words, she realized how much weight had pressed on her since the confrontation. It wasn't just her reputation. It was the trust of every soldier who had stood on that field, watching, waiting, wondering if truth mattered. Tone softened. "You've carried yourself with dignity. That matters more than you realize. You've reminded every soldier on this base what sacrifice looks like." Her chest tightened with conflicting emotions: pride, sorrow, exhaustion. She thought of the men she'd saved, the scars that still throbbed, the way Harrison's voice had cut her down. And now this. Vindication, but heavy because it had come at such a cost. The general closed the folder. "I want you to know something. We're considering you for promotion to Sergeant First Class, not because of what happened yesterday, but because of who you've been consistently throughout your service." Her eyes widened. She had dreamed of it maybe in the quiet corners of her mind, but hearing it spoken aloud, it felt surreal. She nodded once slowly, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Thank you, sir." The meeting ended with a salute. She walked out, heart pounding, body aching, soul heavy with the weight of recognition she had never sought but could no longer avoid. Outside, sunlight struck her face. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, letting the warmth ground her. But as soon as she opened them, whispers followed her again. Respectful, curious, some even reverent. She hated it. She wasn't a symbol. She was a soldier who had scars. That night the barracks were filled with quiet talk. Soldiers spoke of Harrison's downfall, of Maria's scars, of what it all meant. Some said justice had been served. Others said the army had finally listened. Maria listened in silence, lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. She didn't feel justice. She didn't feel triumph. She felt tired. Sleep didn't come easy. Memories did. The blast, the fire, the men screaming her name as she crawled to them, blood soaking her uniform, hands shaking but never stopping. The sound of her own breathing as surgeons cut into her shoulder, the months of therapy where every small victory was won with tears and grit. Coward, the word returned, unbidden, sharp and cruel. No matter how many soldiers spoke her truth, no matter how many medals hung on her chest, some part of her feared that word would always haunt her. At dawn she rose, laced her boots, and walked the track alone. Every step sent pain rippling through her shoulder, but she didn't stop. She thought about dignity, about service, about scars, and she realized something. Courage wasn't the absence of fear or pain. It was moving forward anyway. It was standing in the middle of a training field, unzipping a jacket, and letting the truth speak louder than any insult. By the time the sun rose fully, she had made peace with yesterday, not because it was over, but because it had reminded her who she was, and who she still chose to be. Why did the air feel different when Maria walked onto the training field again? Maybe it was the way heads turned, eyes followed, conversations stopped when she passed. Respect hung in the silence, but so did something else. Expectation. Soldiers didn't just see her now. They watched her. They carried the story of her scars like a banner, and Maria hated banners. She wanted to be just another soldier again. To run, to sweat, to hurt alongside everyone else. But normal had vanished the moment she unzipped her jacket. Johnson greeted her with a nod, nothing more. He knew better than to smother her with words. That simple nod, steady and familiar, was the closest she got to feeling ordinary. The new PT session began with a different tone. Harrison wasn't there. A captain led instead, calm, measured, not looking for someone to humiliate. "Profiles acknowledged," he said, scanning the formation. "Modified routines were appropriate." The words were plain, but Maria felt the echo of change in them. Quiet change, the kind that lasts. She completed her exercises with control, each movement deliberate, refusing to let her shoulder dictate her worth. The ache never left, it never would, but the fire inside her kept burning. When the session ended, soldiers came to her, one by one, not for pity, for guidance. "Ma'am," a private said shyly, "how do you keep going when it hurts every day?" Maria looked at her, a kid barely 20, face still soft, eyes still wide with the weight of wearing a uniform. She hesitated before answering. "You don't wait for the pain to vanish," Maria said softly. "You learn to live with it, to carry it without letting it break you." The private nodded, eyes shining. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." That moment haunted Maria later. She wasn't used to being asked for wisdom. She wasn't used to being looked at like she had answers. She didn't. She only had scars. By the end of the week, more soldiers came, some with questions, some with confessions, some just to sit in silence near her. She became something she had never asked to be, a mentor, and with that came responsibility heavier than any rucksack. Late at night, lying in her bunk, she thought of those young faces. She thought of the way they looked at her, waiting for guidance, for strength. And she felt torn. She had been a medic, a rescuer, a fighter, but being a symbol, that was something she didn't know how to wear. One evening, Captain Miller approached her in the mess hall. His voice was quiet, respectful. "Staff Sergeant, the General wants you to speak at next week's leadership seminar. About wounded warriors, about resilience." Maria froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Sir, I'm not a speaker." Miller tilted his head. "Maybe not, but you are a story, and stories speak louder than ranks sometimes." She didn't answer, but that night sleep evaded her again. Her mind replayed the convoy in Afghanistan, the night sky lit by fire, the sound of her own ragged breaths as she tried to keep her men alive. She had lived through it, survived it, but to stand and talk about it in front of officers, to peel open the past with words instead of silence, she wasn't sure she could. Days passed. The whispers didn't stop. The requests didn't stop. Soldiers leaned on her presence, not her orders. And she wondered, was this what strength really was? Not the medals, not the scars, but the quiet willingness to let others draw courage from her own survival. The seminar came. A crowded hall filled with officers, NCOs, cadets. Maria stood at the front, uniform pressed, hands clasped behind her back to hide the tremor. The microphone waited, silent, like the stares of everyone expecting something profound. She began with a question. "What do you see when you look at a scar?" The room held its breath. "Most see damage, brokenness, a mark of weakness, but scars," she paused, her throat tight. "Scars mean survival. They mean I faced something that could have ended me, and I'm still here." She told them about Afghanistan, not in detail, not in gore, but in honesty. She told them about holding pressure on wounds while her own blood poured, about choosing not to quit when every bone begged her to, about fighting her way back through surgeries, therapy, nights of pain that felt endless. And then she told them about yesterday, about the word coward, about standing in silence while her body revealed what words never could. Her voice never broke, but her eyes did, glistening under the harsh lights. "I don't stand here because I'm stronger than anyone else. I stand here because I refuse to stop. That's all resilience is. Refusal to quit, to give in, to be defined by pain instead of by purpose." When she finished, the hall was silent. No applause at first, just silence. The heavy kind, the kind that meant something had sunk deep. Then slowly hands clapped, not polite, not casual, respectful, measured, real. Maria walked out of that hall not feeling victorious, not feeling powerful, but feeling emptied. Speaking had taken more out of her than combat ever had. But in the eyes of those who stopped her afterward, young officers, seasoned NCOs, even generals, she saw something new: recognition. That night, sitting alone outside under the stars, Maria realized the truth. She had spent so long trying to hide her scars, to cover them, to pretend she was like everyone else. But hiding them had only fed her shame. Exposing them had freed her. And maybe, just maybe, helping others see their own scars as survival, not weakness, was the mission she had left. But even as that thought formed, something darker whispered at the edge of her mind. Scars don't only mark the body. They live in memory, too. And some wounds she hadn't spoken of yet still waited in the dark. Why did silence feel louder in the barracks that night? Maybe because Maria couldn't escape the echo of her own thoughts. Soldiers respected her more than ever, officers sought her wisdom, and even generals had quoted her words at briefings. Outwardly, she had become a symbol of resilience. Inwardly, she still felt unfinished, as if her scars told a story she hadn't fully admitted even to herself. The past never left her. It waited in fragments, smoke, fire, voices shouting her name from the wreckage. And tonight, the fragments returned sharper than usual. She sat on the edge of her bunk, rolling her shoulder carefully, feeling the stubborn ache deep in the bone. Pain was familiar now, almost a companion, but what it carried wasn't companionship. It was memory. The explosion replayed, dust blinding, metal tearing. She remembered hitting the ground, her breath punched out of her chest. Then voices, groans, screams. One voice she would never forget. "Doc, Doc, help me." Her men hadn't seen her collapse, they only saw the medic, the one who was supposed to fix them, so she did. She crawled, arm useless, blood leaking from her own wounds. She pressed her hand into someone else's torn flesh while her own shoulder throbbed with fire. She kept him alive until they arrived. She had saved him. But she hadn't saved them all. There was another voice, quieter, gurgling. She remembered holding his hand as his breathing slowed, as his eyes begged for something she couldn't give. He had whispered, "Don't let me die here." And she had whispered back, "You won't." But he had. She had lied, not to deceive, to comfort, but the lie haunted her more than the scars did. Now, years later, she felt his hand in hers again, phantom weight pressing down. He visited her in dreams, in quiet moments, in the silence after applause. And every time she looked at the young soldiers who saw her as unbreakable, she thought of him, the one she couldn't save. The army called her resilient, the general called her courageous, but she still called herself guilty. That week her duties continued. She mentored younger medics, oversaw training, gave advice she barely believed in. "Stay steady under pressure," she told them. "Focus on the next life, not the last one." They nodded, grateful. They didn't know her words came from the wounds she still carried. One evening, Johnson found her alone by the track. He jogged up, sweat dripping, breathing hard. "You've been quiet," he said, slowing beside her. Maria shrugged. "I'm fine." Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Fine usually means not fine." She gave a small, tired smile. "You always were too observant." "Look," he said gently, "we all know what you went through, what you've carried, but you don't have to carry it alone." Maria didn't answer right away. Finally, she whispered, "It's not the scars that bother me, it's the ones you can't see." Johnson nodded slowly, like he understood more than he said. He didn't press her. He just stayed, jogging at her side until the sun sank low. Sometimes presence was enough. But that night sleep betrayed her again. She dreamed of the convoy, of dragging bodies, of blood on her hands that never washed off. She woke before dawn, gasping, sheets tangled, heart racing. She sat up, pressing her face into her palms. How could she keep carrying others when she hadn't made peace with herself? The next day, during PT, she saw one of the younger privates struggling on the field. He collapsed mid-run, clutching his side, gasping. Others slowed, uncertain whether to stop. Maria was already moving. She crouched beside him, voice calm, steady. "Breathe. In through your nose, out through your mouth. You're not dying, you're scared, that's all." The private followed her rhythm, slowly regaining control. His wide eyes met hers. "How do you do it? How do you stay so calm?" Maria felt the question strike deeper than intended. How did she? She wasn't calm inside. She was a storm, but she smiled faintly and answered, "Because someone has to." The truth lingered in her chest long after. She had never healed fully. She probably never would. But maybe healing wasn't the point. Maybe the point was being steady enough for others, even when she wasn't steady inside. Later that week, she was summoned again. This time not by the general, but by a chaplain who had heard about her struggles through whispers. She resisted at first, but eventually she sat in his quiet office, sunlight slanting through blinds. "You've seen a lot," he said softly, "more than most." She nodded, words caught in her throat. "Do you want to talk about it?" She hesitated, then told him about the convoy, about the men she saved, about the ones she lost. Her voice cracked for the first time in years. "I promised him he wouldn't die, and he did. I lied." The chaplain listened, letting silence do its work before replying. "That wasn't a lie, that was love. You gave him hope when he needed it most, and that mattered." Maria's chest tightened, tears stinging. She hadn't cried since the hospital. She hated it, but she let them fall now, silent and hot. Afterward, walking back to her quarters, she felt lighter, not healed, never healed, but lighter. She realized then that scars weren't meant to disappear. They were meant to remind her of what she carried and of who she carried. That night she wrote in her journal for the first time in years. She wrote the names of the men from that convoy. She wrote their stories, and she promised herself that she would keep speaking, not for her own sake, but for theirs. She was not just a survivor, she was a witness, and sometimes being a witness was the heaviest duty of all. Why did young soldiers seek her out more now than ever? Maybe it was the way truth lingered in her presence, unspoken yet undeniable. Staff Sergeant Maria didn't chase the role of mentor, but the role had chased her. Every scar, every story that traveled across Fort Campbell pulled others toward her like gravity. In the weeks after Colonel Harrison's downfall, the base was different. The training field carried a new kind of silence, respectful, cautious, reflective. Commanders paid closer attention to medical profiles. Soldiers whispered less about weakness and more about survival. Maria had not only changed her own reputation, she had shifted the culture around her. And yet she felt the weight of it every day. It wasn't medals that made her a leader now. It wasn't rank, though the promotion to sergeant first class was now official. It was something quieter, heavier, the expectation that she would carry others through their own battles, visible and invisible. One morning she found herself sitting across from a young medic named, barely 19, still green. His hands trembled as he admitted, "I'm scared I won't be enough out there. What if I freeze? What if I fail someone when it matters most?" Maria studied him for a long moment. His fear wasn't weakness. It was honesty, the kind of honesty most soldiers buried until it broke them. "You will freeze," she said finally. His eyes widened. "And you will fail. Everyone does, but you'll move anyway. You'll do what you can with what you have in the moment. That's all any of us can do, and sometimes that's enough to save a life." Swallowed hard, nodding, his shoulders loosening slightly. Maria didn't offer easy answers. She offered truth, and somehow that was what they needed most. The Army began asking her to speak more. Conferences, leadership courses, even small gatherings of cadets. At first she resisted. Standing in front of rooms retelling her scars felt like ripping them open again and again. But then she thought of the men she had lost, the promises she had made to herself after the chaplain's words. She wasn't speaking for herself. She was speaking for them. At one seminar, she looked out over a crowd of young officers and asked, "Do you know what leadership really is? It's not barking orders. It's not pretending to be invincible. It's knowing your people, knowing their stories, their scars, and leading with respect, not assumption." Her words echoed, not dramatic, not rehearsed, just raw. And raw carried further than polished speeches ever could. But even as she became a voice, Maria struggled in silence. Nights still brought dreams she couldn't control. Days still brought the ache of her shoulder, the ghost of blood on her hands. Being seen as a symbol didn't erase being human. Johnson noticed. He always did. One evening he joined her at the edge of the training field, both of them watching younger soldiers run laps in the fading light. "You've changed this place," he said simply. Maria shook her head. "I didn't change anything, I just stopped hiding." "That's change," Johnson replied. "For them, for us, for you." His words lingered long after he left. Maybe he was right. Maybe refusing to hide was the only kind of courage that mattered now. Weeks turned into months. Maria's scars became less a source of pity and more a source of pride across the base. Soldiers who once hid their own injuries, both physical and unseen, began to step forward, requesting help, sharing stories. The stigma of weakness softened, replaced by something stronger, solidarity. But Maria never let herself forget the price of that shift. It had been bought with humiliation, with pain, with a word she could never erase: coward. She knew Harrison was gone, reassigned, his career finished. But his voice still echoed in her memory sometimes. And when it did, she countered it with the truth she had lived. She had not been a coward that night in Afghanistan. She had been a medic, a soldier, a witness. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from the family of the soldier she had saved during the IED blast, the one she had crawled to while her own shoulder bled. His mother had written, "He told us you refused to quit on him, even when you were hurt yourself. He's alive because of you. Our family will never forget that." Maria sat on her bunk, the letter trembling in her hands. Tears blurred the words, but she let them fall. For once, the tears weren't guilt. They were release. That night she gathered a few of the younger medics around her. She told them the story she hadn't told anyone else, not in full: the blast, the crawling, the hands she held as lives slipped away, the promises she couldn't keep. She expected them to look at her differently after that, but they didn't. They just listened, eyes wide, silent. When she finished, whispered, "You're why I believe I can do this." Maria looked at him, at all of them, and realized something. The burden she carried wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to all of them, shared, divided, carried together. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was teaching survival. And maybe that was the mission she had been meant for all along. The base kept moving, kept training, kept preparing for wars that never seemed to end. But something in the culture shifted permanently. And every time a young soldier looked at Maria, they didn't just see scars. They saw proof that you could be broken and still stand, wounded and still serve, human and still unshakably strong. Why did the field feel different now? Not because the grass had changed, not because the sky looked brighter, but because every soldier who stepped onto it carried the memory of what had happened there. The morning Maria unzipped her jacket had become more than a story. It had become a turning point. Months passed, and Maria moved through her duties with quiet steadiness. She had been promoted, yes. She had been recognized in speeches and seminars, yes. But those weren't the things she carried most heavily. What she carried was simpler. The nods from young soldiers who looked at her with silent respect. The whispered confessions of fear from privates who trusted her enough to tell the truth. The sense that, without intending to, she had become a voice for those who had none. She didn't ask for that role, but she accepted it, because she knew how it felt to be unseen, unheard, doubted. And if her scars could change that for someone else, then maybe they had purpose beyond her own survival. But purpose didn't erase pain. Her shoulder still ached with every cold morning. Nightmares still pulled her back to Afghanistan, to the blast, to the broken promises. Some days she walked with dignity. Other days she stumbled alone. But even on the hardest days, she remembered something the chaplain had told her: scars aren't lies. They're love. They mean you stayed, you fought, you gave. One evening, she was invited to speak at a larger gathering than ever before. Soldiers from across the division, families, officers, even veterans long retired. She almost said no, but something in her told her to go. She stood on the stage, lights harsh, crowd restless. She didn't use notes. She didn't need them. "I'm not here to give you a speech," she began. Her voice carried, low and steady. "I'm here to tell you the truth." The room stilled. "I was called a coward once, by someone who didn't know my story, by someone who thought scars meant weakness, and for a moment I almost believed him." She paused, breath catching. "But scars don't mean weakness. They mean you survived. They mean you kept going when the world told you to stop." She told them about the convoy again, about the men she saved, about the one she lost. Her voice shook when she admitted the guilt she carried, the promise she couldn't keep, but she didn't hide it, not anymore. "I don't stand here as someone who never broke," she said. "I stand here as someone who broke and kept going anyway." Her eyes swept the crowd. She saw soldiers leaning forward, veterans nodding, families clutching hands. She felt the silence thicken, heavy and reverent. "We can't erase pain, we can't erase loss, but we can choose what to do with it. We can let it define us, or we can let it drive us." She paused, letting the words sink. "Every scar tells a story, not of weakness, not of shame, but of survival, of love, of sacrifice." The room erupted into applause, but Maria didn't smile, not fully, because applause wasn't the point. The point was that someone in that room, maybe a young private, maybe a grieving parent, maybe a veteran who still woke in the night sweating, would hear those words and realize they weren't alone. After the event, as people filtered out, a young woman in civilian clothes approached her. She clutched a folded photo in her hands, trembling as she held it out. "My brother," she whispered. "He didn't make it home, but he served with you. He wrote about you in his letters. He said you saved him once. Thank you." Maria took the photo carefully, her chest tightening. The face was familiar. A soldier she had treated, patched up, sent back into the fight. She blinked hard, swallowing the lump in her throat. "He was brave," she said softly. "Braver than most." The woman's eyes glistened. "So are you." That night Maria sat alone under the stars, the photo resting in her lap. She thought about all the faces she had seen, all the hands she had held, all the promises kept and broken. She thought about Harrison, about the word coward, about the way that one moment had cracked something open, not just in her, but in the army itself. And she realized something. Strength wasn't about how many push-ups you could do. It wasn't about how fast you could run or how many medals shone on your chest. Strength was standing in front of the world, scars exposed, dignity unshaken, and saying, "I am still here." She leaned back, letting the night sky fill her vision. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt peaceful. The army would go on. Missions would come. Battles would be fought. More scars would be earned. But her story, her truth would remain, not as legend, not as pity, but as proof. Proof that courage wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was quiet, steady, relentless. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in that silence, it changes everything.